Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We have with us today Mr. Leon Conrad. So, thank you very much for joining us today, and I apologize for the lag on that drum roll. Sometimes it takes 5 seconds to load up on my soundboard. You can hear people are very excited to have you here in the background. All right, they can shut up now. So, Leon, before we get into your writing, tell me a little bit about yourself. Who is Leon?
Leon is a polymath who grew up in Alexandria, Egypt. I was born in London, UK, but when I was 6, my parents decided they'd had enough. My mother whisked me away to the land of the pyramids, and I grew up among story, souks, bazaars, spices, excitement, and a different world which opened my eyes to what really matters in life. When cultures differ, when people don't agree, story very often is the way through. There are wonderful stories in Egypt about Goha, the wise fool, and I carried some of them with me when I came back to England when I was 18, studied music, went on to do different things, including embroidery, and story has always been a central core to whatever I've done.
Awesome. Love to hear it. So, already on the topic of stories, you got to tell me what some of your favorite stories are and why they're your favorite stories.
Well, the one that comes to mind, Matt, is one that features in my latest book, Story and Structure. I did a huge, deep analysis of it. It's a story from Russia. A story about a young man who is a hunter. He's called Fedot, and he is one of the king's most favorite hunters because he never fails to miss his mark. One day he's out hunting, and he sees a bird in a tree, and he thinks, I'm going to get that bird. But just as he's about to release his arrow, the bird speaks and says, don't. If you take me home, put me on your windowsill, and just as I'm about to fall asleep, slap me so hard that I fall down to the floor, your fortunes will be changed. Now, what he does as a result of this very strange instruction is a story you will have to find out for yourself.
Awesome.
But that is one of my favorite stories. Not because of that bit, but because of what unfolds after.
Awesome. Well, thank you for leaving a little bit of that shrouded in mystery. I appreciate that. I'll have to look that up after. So you wrote a book though, and it's called Story and Structure. And I think I love the meta idea of writing about writing. But first, you talked about moving to Egypt and being involved in storytelling. But what really drew you to write this book specifically?
So I was reading a book about narrative, because I'm, like you, into story and writing, and not just writing, but oral storytelling and oral traditions in general. The book was by someone who I admire greatly. It's called The Cambridge Guide to Narrative by H. Porter Abbott. And he came up with this claim that what makes the story of Cinderella is a question we will never be able to answer with any certainty. And that made me stop in my tracks. And I thought, why not? How come you're so sure that we will never know what makes the story of Cinderella the story of Cinderella? After all, there are over 1,000 versions of the story that have been recognized as versions of the story of Cinderella. So there must be something. But the content differs. Sometimes it's dresses going to balls, sometimes it's 3 times, sometimes it's shoes, sometimes it's different things. What makes the story of Cinderella recognizable? And that set me down a path. At the time, I was working with a storyteller, Giles Abbott, who, this was before the book 7 Types of Plot by Christopher Booker was published, had worked out his own way of looking at story structure. And it's thanks to him and to many others, Joseph Campbell, Marie-Louise von Franz, and many others, that I have developed my own way of looking at story. Chief amongst the people whom I owe a great debt to is a guy called George Spencer Brown. And it's his work that inspires mine and my new way of looking at story.
Okay, got it. So, you're talking about Cinderella and how it's been told 1,000 different ways, but I guess ultimately I have a question, which is, do you think that every story has already been written?
No, but I think that stories have an internal logic. And beyond the very basic beginning, middle, and end that any story needs to have, stated or implied, there is a logic which is linked to the initial problem you start with and how that gets resolved or not resolved at the end of the story. What happens in the middle really is framed by those two things. So the patterns that emerge are what makes story structures differ. You can have a story structure like the rags to riches structure, which the Cinderella story is based on. And you don't have to just tell the Cinderella story using that structure. You can tell an indefinite number of stories using that structure. But there will be that recognizable structure underneath it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I was checking out your book on Amazon, and you said that you identified 18 different story structures. Now, I won't sit here and make you name them all for me, but why don't you talk about a couple and maybe some contemporary examples of what those are?
Sure. Well, let me start with, rather than giving you examples from films and books, which everyone does, let me go back to oral traditions. The kind of stories we grow up with as kids, because they are very underrated, very represented in these kinds of conversations, and I want to bring them back. Why is it that stories like The Three Little Pigs are so popular, so sticky? Why is it that you probably remember how it goes? Don't you, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. You got the three pigs, and they all built their different houses, and the wolf came and puffed them down, but then the one with the brick stands up, right?
There you go. You got it in one. That structure of the pigs were the problem, which was implied in your telling. They needed to set up their houses and lives as independent little piggies, were thankfully met by people with the materials they needed to build their houses. As a result, the wolf was able to blow down 2 of the houses, but not the 3rd, and they ended up defeating the wolf at the end. This structure, where you have an opening, characters faced with a problem, the characters go on a journey as a result of having that problem, they meet friends and helpers, they have to defeat an enemy or hindrance, and that leads them to an ultimate final situation, an outcome or a resolution, which leads the story to a close, is the quest structure. It's very simple, and if you know the storyline of the Three Little Pigs, then you know the quest structure. But what I reveal in this book is that the quest structure is exactly the same structure we use when we grow out of the Three Little Pigs and start to write academic essays, let's say middle school, senior school. You have the topic, that's the character. You have the problem, which is that people can't agree whether they're on one side of the fence or another side of the fence in relation to that topic. So the journey you go on is the methodology. You go and interview the people who hold one opinion on one side of the fence, see why they believe what they believe. You go over to the other side of the fence, listen to the people on that side, find out what they believe and why they believe it, and then you come to a conclusion. That's the outcome or resolution. You've just taken the same journey as the Three Little Pigs did. And that is what is special about story and structure. I make these links that you're not expecting between different genres. And I love telling this story to academics Because academics sometimes, although I have a great respect for them, can be very serious. And they need to lighten up a bit. Telling them that the brilliant papers they write are basically restatements of the story that the three little pigs follow in the Three Little Pigs.
They don't like
Always
to hear
brings a
that.
smile to my face.
Awesome. I like that humor that you threw in there. Okay, so we have 18 different story structures. You just gave me an example of the quest, for example, and I'm curious now if you think that this is a positive or a negative for writers coming in knowing that there are only 18 different structures that they can choose from. Is this a positive, hey, you have something that's outlined for you that you only have to fill in the blanks with your own creativity, or is it a negative where it's like you have to stick with these 18 and you have no way to get in and out? What's your opinion on that?
Well, for me, Matt, it's a positive. It's only negative if you take the 18 as set in stone, which they are not. And I invite writers to come up with new structures using the very six very simple primary symbols I use to delineate, to map the structures. What I say in the book is that these are 18 structures that I have identified to date. There may be others out there. I just haven't come across them in 10 years of research. That's how long it took me to write the book and come up with this original methodology. And what I invite writers to do is to use the basic principles of the methodology, which is that story in the middle is based on particular kinds of events that happen in individual characters' storylines. Either those events can propel them forwards towards their goal, or they can add tension and stop them, propel them slightly backwards or stop them in their tracks. And they have to hang about, maybe talk to a character, maybe solve a problem, and then move forward. Those are the two basic moves. Then there are the surprise moves, the trickster moves, which come in and add a bit of excitement and spice to the mixture. But those are the three basic kinds of moves, and you can combine them. You can expand them, you can contract them down according to how you want to tell a story. But that's it, really.
Okay. So I'm sure you've heard the comparison before of how The Lion King is exactly the story of Hamlet, right? Have you heard that before? So when someone is writing...
West Side Story?
A West Side Story too? Okay. I never thought of that one.
No, not Hamlet. West Side
Romeo and
Story
Juliet.
is Romeo and Juliet, right?
Yeah, there we go. Got it. Yeah. So when a new author is approaching, hey, let's write a template or write my own story with a template, how would you recommend that they begin that?
It is very much a question of deciding who your character is, who your main character is, where they are, and when the story is set. You could tell a very similar story, a star-crossed lover's story or a Hamlet story set in the world of the Lion King, set in the Shakespearean context, or in ancient Sumeria, if you wanted to.
Okay.
It just depends on how you're doing it. You could make it futuristic. Everything depends on the character and their setting. And then it goes from there. World building, fantasy, science fiction comes into that. But also being able to create a world, whether it be fantasy, animal-based, historical fiction, accuracy comes in. It's as simple as that. Then
Okay. Awesome. So
make it exciting. Give the order.
Sorry, I think we got a little bit of lag going on. Being across the pond does that to you. So I was going to ask, you mentioned world building. Go ahead and tell me a little bit about your thoughts on world building from a perspective of someone who's building an entirely new world, like a fantasy world or a sci-fi world or something like that. What things are important to keep in mind?
Keep it convincing. And story structure can help you here. because you can map huge arcs of time and condense them down, as well as mapping the storylines of individual characters that fit within those larger spans of time. It's a question of consistency. Have what you need there, don't have anything that is unnecessary, and go on a flight of imagination. It's the same with oral storytelling. When you build a world and you really enter it in order to have a story come alive for the listeners, you will always know more than comes over in your telling. A great oral storyteller I have worked with, Shona Lee, who is, as far as we know, the last Drutzilla from an unbroken line of Jewish women storytellers that goes back at least several hundred years, once said to me, "You need to know everything you tell, but you don't need to tell everything you know."
Yeah.
I thought that was very wise.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, as an author myself, I have often pages and pages of details just to keep the back end straight, you know, the world building on my side, or, you know, things that happened to the characters in the past that the reader may never know unless they read my appendices or something like that. But it is very interesting. It gives such a richness and liveliness to a world. I was talking with another author recently, and he was like, "I love just mentioning something in passing conversation. You know, I like the forest of the dark forest or something like that." And then the reader has to go like, "What is the dark forest like?" And then they have their own set of imagination and all their own stories that are generated in their own head, when this was just like a throwaway line in a conversation. So very interesting how you can manipulate your readers with just a couple lines of backstory. Have you ever
Yes,
written any
and
of your own novels?
I'm working on a memoir at the moment. I also have young adult work in the back burner position. I touch it now and again, come back to it, tweak it a bit, and then leave it. I have performed as an oral storyteller more. I was looking at what I've done in the past recently, and I was thinking, have I been a fiction writer? No, but I have told a lot of stories.
Awesome. You do have such a great vocalization. I can tell that you have drama behind everything you say. I was involved in stage acting for quite a while in college, and so I kind of envy your tone.
Well, your tone isn't bad yourself, Matt. It's
Well,
a
thank
joy to speak to you. But thank you for the compliment.
Awesome. So I'm curious if you have any insights into how the structures that you've discovered impact other mediums, such as, you know, short stories or screenplays or poetry or anything like that.
Let's go with poetry, and if you want to hear more about the others, then ask me. Poetry is interesting because one of the chapters in my book is devoted to explaining why we have specific poetic forms. Forms like sonnets, or haikus, or landays, or limericks. The reason why, I've found, is that each of them follows a particular story structure in terms of how you arrange the pattern of expectation that comes out of a very natural response to rhythm and rhyme. Let's take the limerick. If I say da 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 da, where does that leave you?
Da 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 da. Or something like that.
It's so natural, isn't it? Yes. We have these patterns built in or embodied into our psyche, just as we have story structures embodied in our psyche. That's the depth I go to. I'm looking at these deep patterns and saying, hey, I've recognized them in story. I've recognized them behind popular poetic forms. Now look at the link between the two and see what you can learn. What can you learn by looking at a limerick and the form of a limerick and the story structure it's related to and the kinds of stories that are told using that structure? So that's what story structure can illuminate and reveal that's new about poetry.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for that insight. Let's see here. I think we're getting a little bit of lag. Is it done now? All right, I think the lag's done. Okay, so let's talk about your publication a little bit. Did you do self-publishing or did you go a traditional publishing route?
There was a bit of a lag there, Matt. I heard,
Okay.
did you?
Okay, all right. Are we back? I think we're back. So where I was going was, let's talk about your publishing for a little bit here. Did you do traditional publishing or did you do self-publishing?
This particular book is a mixture of both. I self-published the hardback limited edition of Story and Structure, and I traditionally published the paperback edition.
Interesting. So I've never spoke to someone who's really done both, especially for the same book. So tell me the positives and negatives of each side of the industry, if you will.
The positives are that it allowed me to have more control over the design and layout, which is something I really wanted. Originally, the book was accepted for publication by Routledge, and they would not print the number of tables I thought was necessary to include in the book. And what makes the story structures visually easy to scan is the fact that they're presented as tables. And that didn't go anywhere. Unfortunately, we couldn't come to an agreement, so I just went off, continued doing my own thing, and ended up striking a deal with a conventional publisher who allowed me to do the layout and do a very limited edition, hardback, and took the paperback version on.
Okay. Got it. How would you say that the business aspect of self-publishing versus traditional publishing is different from your perspective? Because I guess in traditional publishing, they kind of take care of all the business, all the marketing, all the what do you call it when they disseminate the work? All the shipping and all that stuff. Can't even think of that word right now. But how is that different for you in
Yeah, the wholesale distribution.
Distribution, there we go. That's the word I was looking for.
Well, self-publishing nowadays, you can publish with companies like Ingram or Amazon. They look after the printing, they look after the distribution. You have to work on the marketing and the publicity.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
That is where... Because you've written a book. It's a good book. You want to sell the book. You want people to read it. Addressing that gap is really the key thing. I worked with two publicists, one in the UK, one in the US. Both did some really good, useful groundwork for the book, and I'm very grateful to them.
Awesome.
As a result, I've got pieces coming out in Writing Magazine in the UK that feature story and structure, that are more populist, that are more practical, that show writers how they can apply this in their ongoing work, how the quest structure, for instance, applies to all stages of the writer's journey, from conceiving an idea to writing the work to publishing to disseminating it.
Okay, cool. So as we're wrapping up here, I always like to ask authors, what's the goal with their book? And I think people might have goals with fiction that are different than nonfiction in your case, but I'd still love to hear, what impact you would like your book to have on the writing community.
I would love people to play with the approach. It's a very simple approach. It is based on 6 simple visually intuitive primary symbols that anyone can write down little bits of paper, move around, get to know what they stand for, and then have fun with. I would love people to have fun with their writing. I would love people to separate a bit more than I'm used to seeing, two levels of story. One is story structure, which is the events that happen at the time of the tale. And the other level is plot patterning, which is how you arrange those events at the time of the telling. Get the story right at the level of story structure, know the events that need to be told, and then play with how you tell them. That's where your flashbacks, your flash forwards, your interesting framing devices, your multi-layered character narrative hopping can happen. Doesn't need to be head hopping, can be just multiple narratives as you get in Game of Thrones. It becomes an artistic thing. Story structure is deeper. I would call it more spiritual. But there's a spiritual aspect to both, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, any final comments before we wrap it up?
I would love to hear from people who engage with the work, maybe have questions. Find me online, leonconrad.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Substack. You can find me on Medium. I would love to hear from you.
Awesome, absolutely. And I will love to pick up your book and tell you my thoughts on it as well. So I'll probably be doing that here shortly.
I look forward to that, Matt, and thank you. And do get in touch if you're listening, because I frequently release special offers or competitions, chance for you to try your hand at things, save some money maybe. It'll be awesome to connect.
Sounds great. Well, thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, Matt.